and welcome to the Books on Asia podcast, sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years, located at www.stonebridge.com. And I'm your host, Amy Chavez. Today I'm talking with Janine Beichman. She is a translator, an author. She's translated the poems of Makoto Ōoka, 2 books, one called Beneath the Sleeping Tossing of the Planets, Selected Poems, and another called Ori Ori no Uta. She's also penned a biography of Masaoka Shiki, his life and works, and one for Yosano Akiko, Embracing the Firebird, Yosano Akiko, and the Rebirth of the Female Voice in Modern Japanese Poetry. Welcome, Janine.
I was really impressed that you read all those books. You know, most people don't. Even my parents didn't read them.
When I started reading Masaoka Shiki, his life and works that you authored, I really saw the value in these types of books because it tells you not just that these are famous poems, but it tells you why. And I totally got addicted to like reading your explanations. And of course it can't help but also make one a better writer or poet, of course, at the same time. Mm-hmm. And there's so much reference in Japanese culture and, of course, the seasonal words and all of that. So I thought that we would start with the Masaoka Shiki book. And if you could tell us why he is such an important poet in Japan and a bit about his transformation from haiku to tanka.
Well, he's always considered the father of the modern haiku. And actually, I don't know, you probably know this, but the people, not everyone listening will know, is that when in 1868, when the Meiji period began and Japan's modernization began, for the sake of convenience, we give a date. Things are actually not that cut and dried. But at that point, a lot of Western influence began to come in. And one of the first things that happened in the cultural realm was a great sense of doubt and loss of confidence in traditional Japanese poetic forms, such as the haiku, the tanka, and the ways they had been practiced. So what he did is he actually, I suppose, reinvented the haiku in a way that made people feel that it wasn't déclassé or stupid or old-fashioned to practice it. And he did that by many ways, but the principal way was by applying the doctrine. I don't know if you should call it a doctrine, say a new technique and a new way of thinking about haiku as a poetic form that was based primarily on observation of the things around you and of your world. And that made it a more realistic form. And he also was a magnetic, charismatic, brilliant person who was able to gather people around him. So that's why he's so important. And also another reason that he's important is he took his new approach, this new realistic approach, not only into haiku, but also into tanka and also into prose. And so he was very close friends with Natsume Sōseki, who wrote not only haiku, but also classical poetry in classical Chinese called kanchi, and also, of course, many famous novels. Sōseki is, I suppose, the greatest or one of the 2 or 3 greatest of modern Japanese novelists. So in that sense, Shiki also influenced the development of modern Japanese fiction very much. And I mean, I'm not really interested, to tell you the truth, in these things about why people are important because they had influence and so on. I like to read what they really wrote. And I'm here to tell you that Shiki is a wonderful, wonderful writer, especially in his diaries and in his criticism. It's just, it never fails to be interesting. To me, even more than his haiku and his tanka, which are interesting in themselves, his diaries are fascinating and his short prose essays.
Well, in your book, you include a couple of the diaries in the back. And I feel the pain and see the beauty is exceptionally beautiful. And what I really loved in this also was the tanka succession that you put in here. These are all, of course, your own translations, right?
Yes.
because I've read some of translations of both Shiki and Yosano Akiko in other books. And actually, it was just the other day, I actually got a copy of Tangled Hair and an older copy, and read one of the poems that you have in Firebird book, and I was so disappointed. I just felt it was so simplistic. And after having read your book, I just knew how deep she was. I was like, no, I want to linger over this poem and think about the beauty and all the things you've taught me to look for in her poems.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It makes sense.
I'm so glad.
And of course, you're quite known for your command of the Japanese language. And in your book, Ori Ori no Uta, Poems for All Seasons, it's addicting because you have the Japanese right next to the English that you translated. And not only is there Japanese, but there's the kanji, and then there's the furigana. So you can see how you've translated it, you know? And at first I never thought that I would be so interested in this, but it's right there. And you're like, wow. And all the beautiful Japanese words, right? That I've heard of before. And then, you know, I read the English and then I look over and it's like, oh, you use that word. You know, that's how you translated that word. And so it's quite intriguing. And certainly Ori Ori no Uta is not a book that's easy to put down. You just keep, you just want to see what the next poem is and the explanation of it. And of course, the explanations are by Ōoka Makoto, right? And
yes.
He's also very, you know, very good. And that book has just poems for everything in it, from the Manyoshu to modern poets. And so it's quite, you know, a very interesting and intriguing book. But getting back to Masaoka Shiki, I liked the Tanka succession. Now, is that something he started, the Tanka succession, or is that something you find?
You mean the Rensaku, the Tanka series, or whatever it's called? Yeah. I believe that he began it. When I first told that to my thesis advisor, Donald Keene, he said, oh, people say that Ito Sachio began that. And Ito Sachio was Shiki's disciple. But actually, it was Shiki who began it. And it's very clear because that series is in his diary and he gives it as a series. It may be Ito Sachio who theorized it or something like that, but Shiki really began it.
So could you clarify for readers, what is a haiku, what is a tanka, and what is the difference between the two?
Well, just putting it very simply, a haiku is 17 syllables, usually broken into 3 segments, although it may be written out as one line or any number of lines. And a tanka is 31 syllables, usually broken into 5 segments. And sometimes people also divide it into what they call upper and lower verses, kaminoku and shimonoku. And then the first 575 would be the upper verse, and the last 77 would be the lower. And it's just a kind of, for convenience sake. So that's what they are. And they're both very, very old forms. The tanka is older than the haiku. It used to be called just the waka, but that's just sort of the basic template. Okay. Yeah, there's plenty of room for breaking the rules.
Embracing the Firebird. This must have been a really fun book to write.
That's wonderful that you say it must have been fun, because while I'm in train of doing it, it's just, you know how it is. You write too. Do you think, oh, this is so much fun when you're writing? No. Have you ever thought that?
No. But there are parts. I think the funnest part of writing anything is the research. And when you find out things and then you start stringing them together.
Yes, that is fun. Yeah. Yeah, and the first time you read something and you think, oh, this is wonderful, I have to do this, and no one else has done it before, that's fun. It's when you start having to prove things and write the bibliography and all that stuff, you know.
Oh, that's just, that's the worst part, I think, is doing those kind of more mundane tasks. Yeah. But this was my first introduction to Yosano Akiko. I didn't know about her poetry before. So what got you interested in Yosano Akiko?
It was the beginning of the second wave of feminism, and I wanted to do a woman poet or woman writer. So I was looking for a woman, and I was looking for someone who had been happy, who had had a long marriage and children and had been able to achieve what they call work-life balance in Japanese, because that's what I was trying to do. And, I was teaching, and I was also married and had a small family, not like Akiko did, who gave birth to 13 children. But anyway, I was looking for someone who could be a model, who I wouldn't mind spending a lot of time with, and who at the same time was a really good writer. And I knew about Akiko because when I was working on Shiki, she was like his polar opposite. He died in 1902 and she lived until 1942. But actually, he was about 11 years older than she was. He was born in 1867 and she was born in 1878. And her husband, Tekkan, was actually a friend of Shiki. So they were part of the same literary world, but they were polar opposites. Akiko was a romantic, and where Shiki would look at an objective way at nature and write about it, and then somehow there would be a feeling that kind of was there, but it wasn't explicitly stated. Akiko would identify with nature and become one with it. And it was as if nature was kind of mapped on her body, or her body was mapped on nature. And when I was working with Shiki, I kind of looked down on that. I thought, oh, that's very, fake and false and so on. But then when I looked into Akiko more, I saw, no, it's not true. It's just a different way of doing things, a different way of looking at things. And so I thought, well, I'm going to look into this more. And she just got more and more interesting. She's like she in a way, the more you do, the more there is, and the more interesting she becomes. And Masaoka Shiki is the same way. They're both great writers. So in a way I fell into it, but in another way I was looking for someone like her. Mm-hmm. And also the other wonderful thing was that at that time, when I began working on her, it was like the early 1980s. And there were still a lot of people who thought that she hadn't written anything interesting after Tangled Hair. And by the time she was 30, you could just write her off, even though she kept writing and published and so on till she was 64. It wasn't interesting. She kind of become a good wife, wise mother. And thanks to feminism and feminism critique of women writers, I thought, well, that's probably not true. That's probably narcissistic male critics and other people who agree with them or who are dominated by them who have made that, and let's look and see what she's done. So the first thing so that was another attraction, that there was something I could do that would be new and different. So when I looked into her later works, I found, yeah, they're wrong and they're stupid. And that was a big pleasure. And then Ōoka Makoto, who was one of the great, he was just so wonderful to me. He had just begun a little magazine called Kashin, meaning written with the character for flower and God. And he asked me to write something about Akiko because he knew I had begun. So the first thing I wrote was this very, punch him in the face article in Japanese about, everyone says Akiko stopped writing anything interesting when she was 25, but really, what do you think about this? And what they're saying is so stupid. And then I was able to quote these male critics like Yoshida Seiichi, who had said some really dumb things about her and about women writers in general, and to say that, look, this is really stupid. And obviously their verdict about Akiko's accomplishment is not based on what she did, but on what they think about women. And Ōoka published that. It was just a short little thing. But the fact that he would take that seriously made a huge difference to me. And I think at that point, that was when I really started getting into it very seriously and realizing this is a really important topic. So now I think she's just so important in the things that she did and the things that she wrote.
Is she the first feminist Japanese poet?
She had her quarrels with feminism because the feminists in Japan, like Hiratsuka Raicho, thought that the government should support women, that they should pay their domestic labor. And Akiko didn't think so. And there was a big, very famous debate about that. And she wasn't even sure that women were ready to have the vote, even though she thought that they should have it. She had a lot of doubts about women. Yeah, but let's say, I think we can say she's the first feminist Japanese poet. Yes, let's say that. I think it's safe.
So let's talk about Makoto Ōoka's Beneath the Sleepless Tossing of the Planets. How did this book come about?
that came about because Sam Francis, the painter, who was a close friend of Ōoka, wanted to publish a book of translations of Ōoka's poetry. And by that time, I had been working with Ōoka on various projects for, about 10 years or so. And so he asked me if I would translate the book. And then the publisher was Katydid Press, run by Thomas Fitzsimmons, a poet and also a close friend of Ōoka. And so I did the translations. Ōoka vetted them all. And then I asked Donald Keene to look at it, and he vetted them. And of course, all along, my husband was helping if there were things I had, problems with and so on. And my children were also looking into things. It was a kind of group effort. And so that was published. And then later it was republished, as I said, by Kuroda-han to 2018, I think. We corrected typos and stuff like that. And I added an introduction, and we added the Japanese, and we added illustrations. So it's really a different book, but the translations themselves are almost as they were. One or two things of wording were changed.
In this one, you also have the Japanese, but they're separate in the back of the book, which is good.
Yes.
Many people don't read Japanese, so it's not in their way then. And also, it really highlights the beautiful formatting of the book.
Well, we thought of doing it, side by side, but it didn't work. It was impossible to do because, when you have long poems like that, you just can't do it side by side.
So in Ori Ori no Uta, your Poems for All Seasons, the anthology, did you select the poems in here? Because they are shorter, and were able to have that side-by-side Japanese and English format, 1 page of Japanese and 1 page of English. And not only that, but the text is nice and large, so that you can have the poems, and then the explanation is in a regular, like maybe 10-point font. So 10 or 12. So this is also a beautiful book. And as I said before, it allows you to actually read both at the same time.
Yeah, well, that book actually is a compilation of newspaper columns. Ōoka for 30 years on the front page of the Asahi Shimbun had his own little column called Ori Ori no Uta, in which he would give a little poem and then a little, explanation of it. And then the Asahi Evening News, which no longer exists, but was the English version of the Asahi Shimbun, decided that they wanted to have an English translation of that once a week. So Ōoka asked me to do that, and I did that for 10 years, once a week. And he originally selected a whole lot. There are 12, 13 volumes now in book form of his original Japanese columns. So he gave me all of those, everything he'd done up till then, because he continued after I actually began. And then what I thought worked as English and what I liked, which are my 2 criteria, I translated. So it was completely up to me, except that he had a vast corpus of things to choose from. But I only chose things that I liked. So his great work as a critic. I mean, first of all, he's a critic. He was a critic. And then he was an anthologist. And there are some people who think that Ori Ori no Uta is really important as an anthology of Japanese poetry, a sort of golden treasury of Japanese poetry, which I was not at all aware of when I did it. I was just kind of doing it for fun. But looking back on it now, I think that actually they're probably right. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that transfers into my book, into my selection, but his definitely, the corpus that he selected was like that. And one of the things he tried to do was to shine light on unseen corners of Japanese poetry as well.
And this also does include Yosano Akiko and Masaoka Shiki, as well.
Right. You can imagine that any poem by Akiko or Shiki I glommed onto and did. So that may be slightly unrepresentative of the balance of his thing.
I don't think so, because there's lots of stuff in here from the Manyoshu and stuff as well, So it really does span the ages.
Right.
Truly. Can we read a couple poems from this books? And do you want to read them though, since you'll do a better job than I would?
Sure. And you said it's page what?
95.
Oh, yeah. This is from Midaregami, Tangled Hair. So should I read it in Japanese and then in English, or vice versa, or what?
That would be great. Japanese first.
Okay. 薄物の日尺のたもと滑り落ちて、蛍流る夜風の青き。Yosano Akiko. Down silken sleeve, 2 feet long, fireflies glide and slide, then flow into the evening breezes green. And Ōoka says, after he describes this and he gives some little explanations of the words, and then he says, now such a scene is close to a dream from a lost world. 今ではそれも失われた幻に近いが、失われた幻に近い. It's so he has wonderful little ending sentences in his explanations.
Well, in this one, he explains, he says that like shining drops, fireflies slide down the long sleeves of a young girl's thin summer kimono, then fly off.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And then he clarifies also the breeze is green. The evening breeze is so fresh, it seems green. Now, such a scene is close to a dream from a lost world. Lovely commentary.
Yeah, it's lovely, isn't it? I mean, to explain, someone reading that, Yokaze no Aoki, literally, the evening wind's green, would think, why is it green? Right. And then he just kind of tells you, he slips it in. It's so fresh, it seems green.
Yeah.
Yokaze mo aoi sawayaka na yoi no sanka.
By the way, there is a new book coming out. It's called The Japanese Linguistic Landscape by Nakanishi Susumu and translated by Ryan Shaljin Morrison. And I just got this in over the transom for a review. And it's really good because it has a lot of these words, akebono and, harusame, has all that stuff in it. And I've noticed some of them in poems, and they even bring up examples in the Manyoshu and such where, these are used. And that's a lot of the trick to reading the Japanese, isn't it? And so Ōoka does a pretty good job of, also cluing people into the cues in Japanese poetry, which are so important.
Yeah. By the way, let me just add, I was just looking at this thing and saying, Aoki, isn't that blue? And I remembered that when I did these translations, I would always send them to Ōoka to vet them every week. I had an old-fashioned fax machine at that point. So it must be him who said that this actually is green here. Do it as green. It wasn't just my, whim.
One of my favorite poems in here, along with the explanation, is by Takahama Kyoshi. Spring snow covers a ladle floating on water. And then he goes down to explain this. And he says that Kyoshi's haiku often offer a sudden glimpse of large worlds through a concentration on small things. And he says that the haiku above is of this sort. A floating ladle is light to begin with. The soft spring snow piled on top of it, lighter still. And what the poem suggests is all of spring itself.
Yeah.
How do you know, Yuki? I mean, this is the thing. It's like translation's great and it's so difficult, but there's just nothing like the original. When you see that Haru no Yuki, it's like takes your breath away, doesn't it? I suppose also because Japanese has the kanji, so you get a lot of, you get the visual as well. And one of the great things that I learned in your book on Masaoka Shiki was how he uses the Japanese words and the sounds of them to get forth feeling. So your hard consonants, ka, 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 and stuff is kind of jarring. And that helps get through something that might be sputtering or stop and go or such. And how the longer vowels, the ah, e, and stuff, help get through the smoothness of what he's talking about. And that really, that was very interesting. and helps to know how to read the poems in Japanese as well. Even just knowing that, even if you don't know the meaning of the words, if you can, pick up on the sounds, it's very helpful.
Yes. Yeah, in the Akiko book, I tried to help people do that by writing the poems out in Romaji and having a capital letter if a sentence began, and then putting slashes between the segments. And that seemed to help.
Because in that book, you only did the Romaji, the spelling in English. There was no Japanese to accompany that. And that was also another interesting way to read the poems.
Well, that was because Hawaii refused to put the index into the book. I spent such a long time writing all the poems out in Japanese and in English. And then they said it was too long, so they promised to put it up on their site. And you can go to their site, to the University of Hawaii Press site, look up Beichman Embracing, and you'll come to the book, and they have a PDF. They have a PDF of the introduction to the book and a PDF of the index, and of the index of poems, because the regular index is in the book, but a poem index, and the poem index has the first 5 syllables or lines, first line of the English, of the translations, and of the Japanese in Japanese. But in Embracing the Firebird, it's only the Romaji in English. And that was because they couldn't have Japanese on the same page. They couldn't do it, technically.
The other thing is, though, that, it's in the Romaji, but the thing is, it's actually in the Japanese style, isn't it? Because they don't delineate, do they? It's more of...
Yeah, they don't delineate. Yeah, they don't.
It's almost natural in that, respect.
Right. People often say that the tanka is 5 lines. It's 31 syllables in 5 lines, but that's totally inaccurate. It can be 1 line, 2 lines, or if you're writing in calligraphy, 25, Yeah, so this is closer to the way the Japanese would look, at least if it was, printed in a book. But I think having, the translation, the Romaji, and the Japanese all in the same page, and then all that commentary would drive people crazy. So I'm sort of glad they're back.
And the Ori Ori note probably sacrificed a lot of explanation as well, but I guess because it came from a newspaper, it had already been done, so.
It had been done. He had 200 characters allowed for each time.
Right.
So that's what it is. And that's why it's so neat.
Right.
In the sense of well arranged.
Yeah. And in this book, of course, you could go on and on. And it's not a short book. It's 337 pages with the index. So, really, you go into quite a bit of detail. And it's fascinating detail. I was really glad to see when she finally got to Tokyo. Rooting for her. I hope she can get away from her family duties and get to Tokyo to be with her lover.
I'm so glad.
And of course, then there were all those, other problems that had to be worked through, because Kekkan's life was not quite as, simple as hers.
Oh, I'm so glad, though, that she appeals to you so much. I find her very, very appealing.
It's all through your writing, I'm sure. If I had just picked up Tangled Hair and just read the poems with no explanations or no background of where this person was coming from, it would not have left an impression on me. So I'm beginning to realize that it's been my mistake all these years not to pick up these, literary biographies, and to help educate myself about what it is that they're writing about. If you want to learn about Japanese poetry, start with the biographies.
Another biography that I really liked was Eileen Ward's biography of John Keats, who actually has a lot in common with Akiko. I used some of his words as epigraphs for the chapters in Akiko because they were so similar. Mm-hmm. But biographies can really be wonderful.
Yeah. Well, you get the best of both worlds because you get the biography as well as the poetry in this case. So
yes.
Who are your favorite Japanese poets?
My favorite Japanese poets?
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Well, I like Ishigaki Rin a great deal. I actually have a book-length manuscript of her poetry. She's a modern poet. Well, you might say contemporary, even though she died about, 10 years ago or so. I really, really love her poetry. And I like Ōoka's poetry, of course, and I like Masaoka Shiki's poetry, and I like Yosano Akiko's poetry. And I also like Yotsumoto Yasuhiro, who's a contemporary poet. He's very interesting.
Great, being able to read the books.
Well, it's lovely for me that you read them with such interest.
Today we've been talking with author and translator Janine Beichman. She's known for her books, Bracing the Firebird, Yosano Akiko and the Birth of the Female Voice in Modern Japanese Poetry, Masaoka Shiki, His Life and Works, Ori Ori no Uta, Poems for All Seasons, and her most recent book, Beneath the Sleepless Tossing of the Planets, Selected Poems by Makoto Ōoka. You've been listening to the Books on Asia podcast, produced and edited by Michael Palmer. Logo by Alex Kerr. Sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years. They can be found at www.stonebridge.com. For more interviews, book reviews, and other features, visit the Books on Asia website at booksonasia.net.